Fáilte Rash Acárja, welcome to Undercover Irish. And on today's episode of Acárja, I really want to look at something that's been a tagline of this particular podcast for a long time, which is the aim is to try to uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. And we try to do it in unusual ways, sometimes looking at ballads or music and sporting events or clubs or organisations on occasion have come up. And this week I've been thinking an awful lot about how the naming of a sports club or a sports organisation can reveal an awful lot to us about history and about the strands of moving history over time. Because sports teams and clubs, their names aren't random. They are identity that is made visible. They tell you who a group is or who they think they are, and sometimes these names come from place, but often they're tied to myth, history or memory. And in Ireland especially, names can carry layers of language, conquest even, rebellion and culture. And often, as we'll find in this episode, the names go beyond Ireland itself. Those stories travel. A club name can preserve something older than the club itself. Sometimes older, and in most cases older even than the two states which exist on a partitioned island. And the GAA, the Common Luchlas Gael, is a perfect starting point, but it's not where we're going to spend the entire episode. Clubs aren't franchises in the GAA like you might understand in the American system. They're expressions of community and history. Across the world, teams use names to rebuild identity far away from home or to carry a memory with them to project power, mythology, and belonging in entirely different ways. So this is a journey through names, from Irish fields and forgotten kingdoms to diaspora clubs and global identities and indeed beyond. Because once you start looking at a name and what it means, you find that this leads on to the next name and to the next name and to the next name. And in fact, the journey never really stops. So Acárja, wherever you are in the world, whether you're at home or part of the great diaspora abroad, Sigi Shear, sit back and enjoy this episode of Undercover Irish. Acárja, Araigling. The name of a sports club or organisation, it's never just a name. It's a memory, it's an identity, and sometimes it's a statement. Now, if you've listened to the podcast before, you'll know that I like to talk often about the idea of Ireland's hidden curriculum, the idea that there are things we can learn about this country and this nation at home and overseas that aren't necessarily written down in textbooks, but they are everywhere, all around us. In songs, in stories, in language, Béarla agus Gaeilge, and today in the names of clubs, sports clubs, organisations. Because if you want to understand a place or a club or an organisation, sometimes all you have to do is read what it calls itself, what it declares itself to the world. If we start Acárja, maybe the most obvious place is the Gaelic Athletic Association, the GAA, or Common Luchlas Gael to give it its Irish name. Most club names at a first glance are fairly straightforward. They fall into a few categories. The first is place. The name of the club is linked to the parish, the townland, or the locality. And of course, this makes sense. Because in the Gaelic Athletic Association, a club isn't a franchise, it's a part of the community. It's where you're from. The second category, most common then, is patriots or indeed patriot movements. Names like Pearse, Connolly, Plunkett, Wolfe Tone, figures from Irish history, particularly the revolutionary period and previous revolutionary attempts. And again, of course, that makes sense because the GAA is founded in 1884. Obviously, the games themselves, hurling, Gaelic football, rounders, and handball are much older, but this is the time when the organisation comes together to standardise the games and to build an organisation in every community across Ireland and later beyond. It's right in the middle of a cultural revival. The GAA is the sporting part of that. But at the same time, there is the literary revival, there is the Avioc na Gaeilge happening. This is the generation or two after Ungurta Moore that's trying to save and restore the Irish nation and the idea of Irish nationhood. The Irish language is being rediscovered, Irish identity is being reasserted, and nationalism, the idea that Ireland should be free and govern itself, is growing. So these names, they tell us what mattered at the time. Place, nation, identity. And then the third most common category is the saints. Because again, Ireland at that time is deeply shaped by religion and by a growing Catholic freedom. This is the time shortly after Catholic emancipation, so for a long period in Irish history, you had the penal laws, and it's around the 1830s that you see Catholic emancipation happen. So these most common names on Gaelic Athletic Association clubs, they come from place, they come from patriotism and patriots, and they come from the saints. It tells us about the time when these clubs emerged. But some names, they don't just reflect identity, they perform it, they say something stronger and sharper and louder. And I'm very taken with some of the more unusual names that we come across in GAA terms. In the previous episode of Carja, we spoke about the importance of a ballad. In this case, the ballad was The Mountains of Pomeroy. And we discovered that the song was written about a Rapparee, and we looked into exactly what a Rapparee was. So, take this name, the Rapparees. Now that's not just a name, it's a statement. A Rapparee historically is an outlaw, not just an outlaw rebel, an outlaw against a growing English rule of the country. Someone who, after defeat, didn't surrender. They disappeared into the hills, into the landscape, and into legend. They fought on in a different way. And that idea that you're not defeated, you've just gone to ground. In this case, they've gone to the high ground, or the woods, places where they can hit and run. That idea is powerful. It's not just history, it's identity carried forward, and it sounds fierce. And so in this example you have a GAA club called Rapparees Starlights, founded in 1972 in Enniscorthy, County Wexford. Rapparees is one side of the club, Starlights is the amalgamation of to the other. You have Madden Rapparees near Milford in County Ardvacha, County Armagh. And historically as well, you had Irish Rapparees around Galbally, now defunct, in County Tyrone, County Tyrone. So these are the first clubs I'm going to mention in a journey that we're going to take, looking at some of maybe the more unusual GAA names and what they can tell us, because every single one of them tells a story. Now, one of the things I like about the names, the Rapparees, or the clubs that name themselves the Rapparees, is the fierceness of that title, the unashamed fighting nature. And if sport on the field is war on the field, war without the fight, then it makes sense for a club to portray an image of warlikeness. And this is a fierce name to adopt. Now, if Rapparees is a fierce name to use and to convey a certain sense of the club, a certain identity of the club, what about the next one? Longford Slashers. What a name, the Longford Slashers. A striking name, and it grabs you straight away. And this comes from a real figure. Miles the Slasher O'Reilly, O'Rahalach. This was a 17th century fighter, in the same way that Rapparees was based around outlaw fighters who refused to bow before foreign rule. Miles the Slasher O'Reilly was the same. And he fought at a time when, around the 1640s, which was a terrible decade for Ireland and her people. The ongoing conquest was happening, Cromwell was on the horizon, and Myles the Slasher O'Reilly was one of those who stood up and defended his area. And he made a last stand at a bridge, a small force, a narrow crossing, holding the line against an advancing army, fighting fiercely until he was killed. And that moment, that story, becomes a name, the Slasher. And that name becomes a club. And the club then carries that story forward, generation after generation. A local legend becomes permanent identity. So we see that, of course, in Longford Slashers GAA in Longford. This name reflects local identity tied to the slasher tradition. Now, Corja, so far we touched very briefly on the most common types of names. So we've got the patriots, the patriot movements, you've got saints, and of course place names. Rapparees and slashers represent a slightly more rare type of name. But rebellion gives us history, mythology gives us something even older. And of course, Corja, when we think of Irish myths and legends, there's no shortage of those. And they too are represented in the names of common Lucas Gael clubs. The best place to start is Setanta. Now, if you know the name, you know the story. Before he became the legendary figure we know, Cú Chulainn, he was just a boy and a gifted hurler, renowned for his skill, or so the story, the myth goes. Full of potential, full of youth. And then comes the crucial moment in his life. Invited to Cullen's house, because of crossed wires, I suppose, the guard dog is released upon him. The guard dog, the prized guard dog of Cullen. And of course, what does he do? He doesn't run, stands his ground, and kills the guard dog in an act of self-defence, using his hurley and his slitter. And of course, this myth, this mythical figure, full of youth, full of promise, and full of skill, in particular in hurling, is represented by a number of clubs taking his name around Ireland and the world today. To give you an example of just two, there's a Setanta hurling club in Donegal, Dún na Ngall, and there's a Setanta hurling club in Dublin, in Baile Ó Chlia. And then we've a nice link to the next mythological figure that's used commonly in the names of sporting clubs, GAA, sporting clubs. Because Setanta, as people who know the myth will know, doesn't run away having killed the hound, the guard dog, but instead offers to take his place until he can train a hound to replace him. He becomes the Hound of Cullen. He becomes Cú Chulainn. And of course, this is how he gets his adult name, or the name he's associated with in later life, in later myth. And of course, Cú Chulainn becomes a common GAA name as well. Just to give you two examples of this, you've got Cú Chulainn's GAA club in Cavan, and you have Gael Cú Chulainn GAA club in Omeath, County Louth, Cúnta an Lú. But of course, they're just two examples. It's much more common than just that. But it's a nice link between one myth and the next, from Setanta to Cú Chulainn. Now, one of the things that we have to notice when we think about the names that club choose for themselves, or a club or an organisation chooses for themselves, it reflects identity. It also reflects a character that they want to portray. In the case of Setanta and Cú Chulainn, although it's the same historical person or mythological person, they're tied to different parts of the story. In Setanta's case, you're talking about youth, potential, beginnings and skill. In the case of Cú Chulainn, who he develops into later, this is a man who's capable of holding off an entire army. And similar to the slasher that we were talking about, Myles the Slasher, Cú Chulainn dies in the myth in a similar way. When faced with his enemies and a losing battle, a battle he cannot win, in the most iconic image in Irish myth, Cú Chulainn ties himself to a standing stone so he can remain upright. And even then, his enemies were too afraid to approach him. And it was only when a raven associated with the Morrigan landed on his shoulder did people actually believe that he was truly dead. So even in death, he faced his enemies, standing. And the idea here is fate is unavoidable, heroism is defiance, and identity is destiny. Even his name, Cú, leads to his undoing. So I find it beautiful and amazing that the mythology is represented in the Gaelic Athletic Association tradition, the CLG tradition, at home and abroad. Two other names that are commonly associated both together and with Cumann Lú Glasgow GAA clubs is Fianna and the Fianna. Now, this is something that's very famous in Irish history in terms of, or in myth, in terms of the band of warriors, the Fianna. And in order to gain entry to this elite band of warriors, you had to be extremely fit, extremely skillful, and extremely good at conflict. And Fianna and the Fianna are two names that we see commonly again on Cumann Lú Glasgow clubs, on GAA clubs around Ireland. Not just one hero, but a group, a brotherhood, a band of elite warriors, hunters, survivors, bound together. Of course, yeah, led by Fianna, but a band of warriors. They're associated with wisdom, the salmon of knowledge. The names don't just say greatness, they say belonging, community, and loyalty. Now, Corja, in those myths that have gone through there, Setanta, Cú Chulainn, Fianna, the Fianna, very much male orientated, and in the case of the patriot clubs that we mentioned earlier on, by and large the clubs tend to be named after male patriot figures. Females are largely underrepresented, but when it comes to the mythology element of it, that's not necessarily the case, because in mythology it opens the door a little bit wider. The representation is a little bit more even. Maeve, for example, Queen of Connacht in mythology, not necessarily remembered for battle in the same way, but for ambition, for strategy, for power. Yeah, she starts a war, but not necessarily for survival, to match her husband's wealth, the Táin. And in that she represents something different: authority, aspiration, control and command. And Maeve is remembered in GAA names. As far away in Toronto, there's a modern diaspora club in her honour. The Queen of Connacht is where she's recalled in the Táin Bó Cúlainn, if you want to look at the myth. And if we recall that every single name chosen for a club or an organisation is a statement, then it's a very powerful statement to pick a female myth. It says something, and it portrays something particularly nowadays as camogie and the ladies' football, the LGFA, go from strength to strength and grow and grow and grow. Now, if Maeve is a myth, the next one we're going to look at is a mixture of a true story and a myth. We're talking about Gráinne Mhaol. Now, Gráinne Mhaol is famous or infamous at times for being what's known as maybe a pirate queen, or that's the name that's given to her from the English point of view at the very least. She's a woman of the sea. She's famous around the west coast, Clew Bay, and that particular area. She is known for commanding ships, controlling territory, defying expectations from her very first and early moments in her life, and even met Elizabeth I, English Queen, as a kind of an equal, or on an equal basis. She was renowned both in terms of real history and in terms of added myths as this female warrior chieftain. So her name is famous, and it becomes a name that carries independence, defiance and power, and a bit of rebelliousness. And of course, she too, like Maeve mentioned a second ago, is a name that features in Westport. There's a modern camogie club in Westport, Mayo, named in her honour, Gráinne Mhaol. And back to the actual clear myths. Similar enough to Maeve. Maeve probably portrayed that power doesn't always come from the battlefield, maybe from other places. We have Deirdre, Deirdre of the Sorrows. So this is a name that's tied up with tragedy, fate, and beauty as well. Deirdre is a name taken by a diaspora club in Chicago, Deirdre GAA. Now this is something softer, but not less powerful. This is Deirdre, Deirdre of the Sorrows. A story of love, of prophecy, of inevitability. She flees Ulster with her lover, pursued, and it all ends in tragedy. And what that name carries isn't necessarily strength in the traditional sense. It is fate, though. It's beauty, and it's loss. Now, when you take a quick step back from all of this, you start to see the naming pattern, or the pattern, the identity that's chosen by every club. It's a choice. It's a choice about what to remember and what to celebrate. A choice about what identity the club, the association, the organisation wants to carry forward and wants to portray. But here's the thing. These names, they don't stay in Ireland, nor is this solely about the Common Lú Class Gael, the GAA. In this episode, we wanted to focus on perhaps the lesser known ones, the more militaristic ones in the case of the Slashers and in the case of the Rapparees, and the myths which may not be as well known or as widespread as the patriots, the saints and the place names. But these names travel across the sea. They travel across the sea with people into new cities, new countries. And when they arrive, they change, they adapt, they survive. And they even cross into different codes and different sports. Because names don't just tell us who we are, they can also tell us where we ended up. In the next episode of Corja, we're going to go across the sea. We're going to look at how the diaspora influenced abroad, overseas, and not just through the lens of the Common Lú Class Gael, but moving to soccer, association football, and the Irish influences on names overseas, beyond and around the world. That episode of Corja is available now as an early release to people who support the show on Patreon. So if you want to get an early access to that Corja, go to Patreon, search Undercover Irish, and for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can have access and you can support this show. Until the next time, Corja, go raibh míle maith agat osach bhealum. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode of Undercover Irish. Slán go fóill Corja agus berigi bua.